Welcome to Girl Country. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Baker. Dr. Baker teaches at the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. He's the theologian in residence at St. Julian of Norwich Episcopal Church, and authors of the books Leaving Emmaus, which we'll talk about today, and as well as Shakespeare, Theology, and the Unstaged God. And he also has a blog called The Diagonal Way. And I feel like the initial inspiration for this conversation was a piece that he wrote on the Diagonal Way about why he's not quite a universalist. So I think a lot of the conversation today will end up exploring that issue. Welcome, Dr. Baker.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and for running this podcast and having great guests. It's great work you're doing, and thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. So let's briefly talk about the book first, Leaving Emmaus. So what is your reason for that title? Because the title seems to play a big part in the themes that you explore in the book.
Yeah, that's right. So clearly I'm jumping off of that, the story from Luke's gospel, the post-resurrection account, and noticing a difference in just the sort of the two ends of the story, the way to Emmaus, something is happening, and then after the appearance of Jesus on the way, the road that takes them back to Jerusalem. And so I use that second part of the journey as really a kind of a metaphor for what theology is. Theology, I say, is let's see, how do I say it? It's reasoning together about witnesses to encounters with Christ.
Yeah.
And that reasoning together is key. So it's not just the encounter that I'm having with Christ and, on the road too, but it's about joining, it's about leaving the sort of the protected space of my own encounter and bringing that into conversation with others and then beginning to reason together. Well, in light of all these encounters, what do we say about God, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I actually mentioned this in one of my recent episodes, because I just got done reading your book on Friday. And this isn't anything that you say in the book, but was a thought that occurred to me as a result of the way you're talking about this in your text, just a reflection on the deeper meaning of the idea of apostle and apostolic, because apostolos ultimately means messenger. So in a way, what you're talking about is this idea of this witness is apostolic.
Yeah, that's right. I like that a lot. And yeah, you're right. It's sort of taking it a step further than what I do, but I think that's really compatible. It's sort of what you're saying. I'm seeing sort of like the work of theology and the work of the apostolic work are sort of coming together in that witnessing act.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Which I think ultimately that's kind of what you envision theology doing, which I think is why it's very broad. You take on a lot, just about every conceivable topic in this book.
Yeah, I really envision it as a kind of baby systematic theology.
Yeah.
Chapters of 10 pages or so that work through all the topics.
Yeah, it's really, I highly recommend it. So let's talk about let's move on. So your piece about why you're not quite a universalist.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about like why do you feel the need to stop just short of like embracing that universalist label?
Yeah, no, I think there's a real gray area there that I find it sort of energizing to explore, because I think the parts of me that are more or less universalist it's a kind of a common argument that I find compelling, that a sense of hell, sort of a doctrine of hell as a place of eternal torment, is incompatible with God's creation, incompatible with sort of the fabric of creation itself and who we are as creatures. There's this fascinating bit from Augustine where he says, now some may say that an eternal punishment is incompatible with temporal sins. And as soon as I read that the first time, it's near the end of City of God, I was like, oh yeah, I'm one of those. And like everything he said after, I was like, no, I'm not convinced. You didn't get me there, because I'm still one of those who says that. So there's definitely that piece of like, that's the part of universalism that makes sense, is sort of the almost like common sense theology that says eternal torment as sort of sort of some sort of teleological process within God's creation just simply doesn't make theological sense.
Mhm, mhm.
But
Do you
then
mind
there's
if I
not.
do you
Yeah,
mind
go
if I,
ahead.
do you mind if I share something with you? Because we've
Yeah,
been
for
doing a
sure.
series on my channel on Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot.
Yeah.
And he actually has a very interesting reflection on this very idea that you were just talking about. He says, this is in letter 8 on justice. Eternal hell is unjust, however, only from a purely quantitative point of view. One compares the limited numbers of years of life or lives on earth with the unlimited number of years of eternity, and thus one arrives at the conclusion that the measure of chastisement is out of all proportion with the measure of transgression, and that consequently there is no justice. But let us consider the problem of eternal hell not from the point of view of quantity, which is absurd, as time does not exist in eternity, but rather from that of quality. How is it with this problem then? The following is the answer we arrive at when we abandon a quantitative correlation between time and eternity. Whoever enters the region of eternity without an ounce of love enters it without an ounce of love, i.e., he enters eternal hell. For to live without love, this is hell. And to live without love in the region of eternity, this is to live in eternal hell. And then he quotes Berdyaev, hell is the state of the soul powerless to come to itself, out of itself, absolute self-centeredness, dark and evil isolation, i.e., final inability to love. This subjective state of soul is neither long nor short. It is as intense as eternity is. Similarly, the blessedness of a saint experiences in the vision of God is as intense as eternity, although it could not so last, since someone present at the ecstasy of a saint would time it as a few minutes. The region of eternity is that of intensity, which surpasses the measures of quantity that we employ in time and space. Eternity is not a duration of infinite length. It is an intensity of quality, which, if compared with time and thus translated into the language of quantity, would be comparable with an infinite duration. So Tomberg goes on in this chapter to essentially affirm both a universal restoration and eternal hell at the same time. And this is part of how he does it. And he chastises a little bit those who he talks about like two groups of people, one who are metaphorically Greeks, who basically have wisdom as an idol, and then who are metaphorically Jew, like God of wisdom as an idol, and then metaphorically Jews who have God of power as an idol. And he says that the path of love is actually in between those. And most heresies arise out of one tendency or the other toward overvaluing wisdom or overvaluing power and not seeing where you can hold, where the paradox can hold together in love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I actually read that after I'd read your blog, and that kind of modified my thinking a little bit and made me understand why the church is typically taken, I say the Orthodox Church has taken the kind of position that it does, where it doesn't really declare absolutely and leaves those things to stand in tension.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like the derivation of a kind of a complexity where maybe in some sense universal restoration and a sort of a qualitative lovelessness may not, there may be qualitative lovelessness within creation, and that may not discount the possibility of a universal restoration. I really like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like a lot of we run in this kind of this is particularly true of our age, is like we tend to reduce everything to this sort of quantitative realm.
Right.
I think this is part of the reason why we have such a hard time approaching the doctrine of the Trinity too, because we think of the Trinity as a contradiction or as a paradox because we're thinking of quantity.
Right.
Where in the realm of quantity, 1 and 3 are different, are completely incompatible things. Whereas in the realm of quality, something can have both the quality of 1, which is unity, while having the quality of Trinity, which is love.
Yeah, and if we think in terms of part of what I do in this chapter of Leaving Emmaus, when I talk about the Trinity, is a kind of gift exchange. There's no sense in which if God is gift exchange, then the sort of the qualitative characteristic of giver of gift is not incompatible with a qualitative characteristic of receiver of gift and gift exchange between. And so you lose that sense of like, well, is it one or is it three? That becomes a less interesting question. The more interesting question is how is God this complete energy of exchange, within God's self?
Yeah, absolutely. Which kind of, so it seems like all that you end up having this. It seems like this is a recurring pattern. It's like if we reflect on this Trinitarian love, I think we can find like a lot of resolutions to a lot of the paradoxes that we have. So a lot of these polarities, like that's where they find their resolution, is in that Trinitarian pattern. And this setting aside, this idea of eternal hell versus universal restoration, like I think Tomberg shows a great way that those things also can be brought together by appealing to that same pattern.
Tomberg, I haven't seen it for years, but isn't that the one that Balthasar writes the preface to?
The afterword, but yeah.
The afterword, that's right. Yeah. Years ago I read that, and I love, there's a line in there that's something like, from Balthasar, that's something like, we need to be careful with the tarot, not because it's incompatible with Christianity or untrue, but because we haven't really developed a pastoral theology for how to make use of it. And I thought that's such a sort of generous and beautiful line.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we've just been analyzing the text really because of all the rich metaphysical insights that it has. Really, I mean, I'm not so much interested in the actual practice of the tarot, but I still think that doesn't mean that. I mean, what you have, and I mean, the tarot is derived from images that are just part of the medieval symbolic worldview, so they still have like deep resonance, whether they're connected to the practice of tarot for divination or not. So yeah.
So can we go back for a second to this idea of sort of qualitative lovelessness?
Yeah.
That's the part I think for me. So I said not quite a universalist. Part of the hesitation around universalism for me is it's, I suppose in one sense, it's that question of whether what would qualitative lovelessness mean from as a sort of judgment on a creaturely life, and I think you got Balthasar in my head now, but he's got that wonderful line where he says, "Last rites is something that we give not because we're afraid that if we don't give it, this person will be judged harshly for the particular form, the shape of their life at the very last moment. But it's a sort of a gift of letting this person go into all eternity, affirming their choice for God, which I think is a really rich way to look at sort of, if you remove the anxiety about will my life be seen as loveless by God? And you just say, look, let's trust that we are God's creatures. It is actually maybe possible here, and this is the qualitative. This is the sort of where I want to qualify universalism. It is possible that God will look at my life or a life and say, what I see there is an utter lack of love. But that's almost got to be a mystery for us. Sort of what that sort of judgment, what would warrant that sort of judgment on God. So from God's part. So what we get to do instead is we get to offer something like rituals that say, hey, let's just affirm our choice and put the judgment of all things back in God's hands. So there's a sort of kind of rich agnosticism, I think, to what I'm trying to say and what I take von Balthasar is trying to say there.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think more to the point, I think in terms of like how it can be practically spiritually enriching, I think that the person with whom that we should most reserve an absolute confidence of universal judgment towards is ourselves.
Right.
So I think if like having a certainty toward others being, not a part of any universal restoration is certainly more problematic.
Right.
From my point of view.
There's something for me, something appropriate about I don't know whether hell's, I mean, I like purgatory as imagery, but some sort of sort of focus of eschatological justice remains appropriate. One of the things I've talked about in the eschatology part of the book is the Shakespeare, what Shakespeare does in The Winter's Tale, where you've got this sort of, you know, a moment in the play that just, it calls for judgment. It calls for a sort of harsh bringing in of justice, and says somebody's just got to say a big fat no to the ugliness that's just occurred from this person and in the midst of this family and in the midst of this kingdom. And Shakespeare does this thing that he'd never done before. Before, he would have these sort of what look kind of like cheap reconciliations, like, oh, I was a jerk and I ruined people's lives. I'm sorry. Can we resolve this? Let's have a marriage, you know? What he does in The Winter's Tale is he says, what if we just break all the rules of drama and we have a 16-year gap? And when we come at the end of this 16 years, we'll see that the king has been in sackcloth and ashes and mourning for 16 years. And the kingdom is it's just sort of gone dark and gray around him. He's really in a kind of hell or maybe purgatory. And what I take that as to be doing is saying, like, the audience is not going to be satisfied by saying, I'm sure he's sorry, can we just move on to Act 5? You know, the audience is saying, no, there's got to be a sort of some sort of intense, extended insertion of judgment here. And that's the part of a doctrine of hell, or something like hell, that I think remains sort of appropriate. Some way of saying, look, human aesthetics demand that, you know, because of the way humans work, and because grace doesn't abolish the way humans work, it perfects the way that we work. There's got to be some way that we can experience that judgment as the humans we are. And maybe that's looks like something like hell.
Yeah, and I think any kind of healthy universalism has to maintain like the doctrine of hell in some form.
Yeah.
Right. And Tomberg manages to do it while keeping the label eternal, by making that turn to the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative. And I think you don't get any idea, like say George MacDonald, it's like you don't get any idea from MacDonald, despite his universalism, that like, you know, that it's a cheap universalism.
Right. That's
right? That there's not that everything doesn't have to be paid to the last farthing ultimately.
Right.
So
that's good. Yeah. For me, that's just as problematic as a sort of a simple black and white sort of two judgments, sort of one eternal for heaven, one eternal for hell. Like that does a kind of violence to human nature, but in a compatible way, I think so does saying, well, mercy and cheap grace, you know, that's what universalism looks like. I think both of those sort of, you lose the thick humanity in the middle for both of those.
Yeah, right. Because then it means that nothing we do matters.
Right. That's right.
And I think that's one thing that's very clear to me in your book, is that you definitely have like in your system, you definitely have a strong role for freedom. You talk about anarchy a few times in the text. I think like 4 or 5 places where you talk about anarchy. Do you want to elaborate what you meant by anarchy, the way you're using it in your text?
Yeah. Let's see. You may have to point me to a passage, because I remember playing with it in a few different ways.
I can check the index. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like 4 or 5 times. The reason I'll maybe just be honest about why I'm a Christian anarchist, so that's part of why it resonated with me. And you seem to be you're not using the term quite in that same way that I would in that context, but it actually wasn't clear to me exactly how you were using it.
Yeah.
So but obviously the term had some resonance because you kept returning to it.
Yeah, I'm trying to use it. Kathy Tanner doesn't use the term anarchy, but you're familiar with her, the way that she uses non-competitive transcendence as a way of talking about the way that we participate in God, but as a utterly different, you know, a differently different kind of being. So there's no sense in which if I am going to say in the realm of ethics, sort of choose the godly act. Well, I can't sort of look at some sort of big brother figure, father figure, some sort of big, you know, some sort of model act that I can see that's happened in time around me and say that's the divine act, because it's always, no matter how big or you know, no matter how big or even sort of supernatural seeming, if I can name the act, then it happened in the world and it's a creaturely act. It's not, I can't actually imagine what divine action looks like. And so in that sense, there is no arche, you know, there is no sort of original godly thing to do that I'm trying to sort of recover in my embodied existence. So there's this, I'm always inventing, you might say, the sort of the next godly act. There's no, I'm creating the model, even as I'm saying it actually is a model, and actually is, I want to be faithful to the way that God acts, and that means I'm going to have to invent it in this moment in a way that it's never happened before. Now I have other models, you know, we have traditions and all of that informs what I do. But I think in some sense, that's really what I'm trying to get at. In some sense, a Christian ethic is always going to have this element of being without arche, sort of building the ship while we sail it, or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. That's interesting. So what do you think about the concept of hierarchy as it relates to theology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe this is where I'm a bit like the meditations, the meditations on the tarot, where I think that if we understand, and this really, if we understand non-competitive transcendence in this way, then maybe hierarchy and anarchy are not incompatible with one another,
Right.
Because we're not talking about a sovereign overlord, because that's still, you know, divine hierarchy is not like, is so unlike temporal hierarchy that they don't even sort of, the analogy doesn't even really hold. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. Let me see what you think of this. Like one way that I've put it in the past is the concept of self-rule. If we're created in the image of God, ultimately what we are destined for is self-rule. But the problem is that if we choose the path of like self-rule, thinking that the way to self-rule is just the mere assertion of our own independent being, it actually ends up enslaving us. So this is again why this paradox of like anarchy and hierarchy can come together. And I also think, speaking of Tomberg's tech, I would also ultimately say that that's like the meaning of the emperor and the pope is ultimately that like the person who's on the path to truly being a friend of God is both the emperor and the pope, like within their own lives.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you know, Dennis's whole cosmic and ecclesiastical structure is based on this sort of these sort of non-competitive spheres of transcendence, where there is a hierarchy within the angelic choir, and there is a hierarchy that's modeled from that within a church. And so you have differences in orders within the church between the bishops and the clergy and the lay, that's in some sense modeled on what you get in the choirs of the angels. But this isn't like, you know, it's not about sort of declaration obedience, you know,
right?
And then you are obedient above, and you know, again, there's sort of there's anarchy built in there, so that what it means to model, you know, the choirs of angels within this particular moment by being responsive within a church hierarchy, for instance. Right. That's something I have to create as I'm going. Mm-hmm. That's what I have to. I'm actively creating obedience in this moment, and so there's that nice little paradox there that allows that to be sort of both, as you said, both self-rule and attentiveness, even obedience to the rule of another.
Right, because the one who is truly self-ruling is also the servant. Like when that's right. That's right. It reminds me
I
of
like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of Tomberg's Tomberg's idea of the cooperation for existence, as opposed to like the sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest. And it's like you can see like within our phenomenal experience, both principles are existing in the world, and we can observe both. But the question is, which are we going to choose to be more ultimately reflective of what the true ground of reality is?
Yeah.
Is the ground of reality is better reflected by this Darwinian principle of the survival of the fittest, or is this cooperation for existence, which you can also see within biology, in which evolutionary biology is starting to see more and more? Is that more of what it is?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I love it. You're making me want to read the Meditations. Maybe let's do this again and let's talk about Tomberg next time. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Well, I just like whatever I've read most recently is like I always am try to make books talk to each other in my head.
Yeah, a good friend of mine and I read. We read parts of that many years ago, but we were just sort of in awe of it and kept passing it around, the library copy, passing it around between us.
Yeah, we decided to take like we've been doing a series on it on Grail Country, and we decided to take it very slowly, like chapter by chapter. So we're doing an episode on every chapter. We just recorded chapter 9, which is the Hermit, this morning.
That's fun.
So yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, I'll listen. I can't wait to listen. That sounds
okay.
amazing.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
So anything else that you want to say about I mean, I think we kind of came to like an understanding on the universalism, and I can kind of see where you have this like kind of hesitation, and how that hesitation is not incompatible with the with a God of Trinitarian love. And so I kind of understand where you're coming from on that. And I can see why the church has had the traditional position that it has. Well, at least I'm talking the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church. Yeah. What do you think about the Catholic? Okay, what do you think about the Catholic Church? Just like saying, oh, there is eternal hell for sure.
Oh yeah, I think it's problematic. I think that's problematic, and I think in many ways, I think I'm married to a Catholic. I am deeply informed by Catholic theology. And I think one of the real weaknesses of Catholic theology is sort of methodological. It's sort of allowing declarations to put an end to theological conversation.
Right.
I've been in conferences and in conversations with Catholic theologians who I had one time tell me, your position really makes a lot of sense to me, but I can't follow you on that because of what the cardinals have said, because of the declarations on this particular point. Now that was just his strict reading of the way that goes, and not everyone would say it that way. But honestly, it left me a little bit sad. I thought, I feel like what we're the joy of being a theologian is you get to gather together with people from different backgrounds, who've read different things, who are compelled by different things, and just hash it out. Just give an account of things as best you can, and by the end, maybe say, I think this feels like the most persuasive way to see it, or let's talk 5 or 6 more times and see if we can come.
Well, yeah, and that certainly is
cut that conversation off is really sad. To be like, yeah, I can't. I'm now out of that conversation because of a declaration by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith or something like that. I was like, ooh, sad. Feel a little sad about that.
Judaism seems to have always had a little bit of a healthier view on that. My wife is Jewish, and it's like it seems like that's just like the rabbinical default.
That's right.
It's what you were just describing.
That's right.
It's just
right.
Like keep the conversation going.
I think I've written about this in the blog, but I had one of my professors at University of Virginia was Peter Oakes, Jewish theologian, philosopher, and he was fantastic to work with. But I remember one of the things that always stuck with me that he said was, the thing about you Christians is, in your eschatology, you think, well, things are foggy now, and we'll keep talking it out, and when we get to heaven, we'll finally get a final answer. He said, we think when we get to heaven, there's still going to be 5 rabbis sitting around trying to argue it out.
Yeah. I kind of get the sense that in your section on eschatology, I kind of get the sense that you side with that view a little bit, because the way you talk about the eschaton, it's like it's not like you think that it's like that's the end of it. And I know you quote C.S. Lewis quite a bit too, and it's kind of like C.S. Lewis's idea of this further up and further in
Yeah.
which is,
Yeah.
I don't, did Lewis read Gregory of Nyssa, or did he just come to that on his own?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I've never gotten the sense that he sort of knew the church fathers well. I don't think he
Right, I
really
don't
did.
either. It's just like
Yeah.
he somehow
Yeah.
intuited
He
this
did though. Yeah.
and put it in his fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
Another piece, maybe just this may be a little out of order now, but sort of disorder, a little bit disordered, but taking us back to the hell conversation. I don't think this was in the book, but a bit from Lewis that seems also really appropriate and really fitting for understanding what that judgment moment is, when it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when Aslan talks to Edmund.
Mhm.
And there's that, like, I had Edmund has brought sort of destruction on Narnia and himself and his siblings. And this is he has clearly sort of, he has clearly been, lied and been manipulative and all of this. And he goes off and has a hard talk with Aslan, and there's some sense of like, that whatever happened there, it was the appropriate thing that happened. And I think, I had a conversation with a student of mine, a new graduate of mine a few years ago, who had a sermon to preach, and it was a sermon for a really difficult person who'd been difficult in his family and been impossible to live with for lots of reasons. And we were sort of processing together, how do you do this? How do you sort of, preach this sermon? And that's one of the things that we came to, like whether you say it or not, one of the things to hold in mind is that I don't, I think his words were, I don't know if this man is going to go to hell forever, but I think at least he and God are going to have a really hard conversation.
Yeah.
And I think there's some sense where that's the kind of what I say about the sort of ascetics of judgment that I want to hang on to. Some sense of a hard conversation that I'm going to be having with God when I, when I come before God as the judge of all things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think even if you're a universalist, you still need to hold this. I really love, like, there's a YouTube channel called Love Unrelenting that's always posting videos on Christian universalism, and it has a lot of interviews with a lot of different people. And one of the people that it had an interview with was Robert Hart, David Bentley Hart's brother, who's also a continuing Anglican priest. And Robert Hart, who is a universalist, he is like, he talks about this story about how he had this woman who was in medical need, and he had this, wealthy parishioner that was with him at the time when he got this call where this woman was asking for help, and this guy had no willingness to help. And Robert was saying how he wished he would have reminded this gentleman of, like, the judgment of hell. Like, because even if you do believe in the ultimate restoration of all things, that doesn't mean that there's not
Right.
ultimate justice for everything that has happened.
Right.
So
yeah, that's right. And I think one of them, I don't remember if I said this in the blog or not, but one of the things that can annoy me sometimes theologically in universalist sort of constructions is a sort of mechanism of, like, overly mechanizing universalism. Like, if I can show this and this and this, then what I have just proved is that in the end all are restored.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, so for me, it's like, and this is, von Balthasar again, has his sort of classic text, "Dare we hope that all might be saved." And I love, it's a great book, but I even love that title, because he frames the question like that, like, universal restoration is a hope. And if it becomes a sort of mechanistic solution, then I think we're missing something, because there is that, we're missing the possibility. Like, if I've solved it mathematically, then I don't need to hope.
Right.
But the virtue of hoping for universal restoration does good in me, and it does good in our churches, and it does good in Christian conversation.
Yeah, that's that Greek certainty that Tomberg warns about, even though he does ultimately believe in the universal restoration. I think that's also why, to me, like, David Bentley Hart's book, Doors of the Sea, is so much better than That All Shall Be Saved. That All Shall Be Saved, like, really crosses the line into that Greekiness.
Yeah,
like, it's too precise, it's too much overkill, it's too much confident It's too much confidence. Whereas there's just in Doors of the Sea is there's so much more pathos in that book.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful
and it's
book.
a beautiful book.
Yes, it is.
Even though in terms of systematic argument, he's obviously the systematic argument he lays out in That All Shall Be Saved is much stronger than in Doors of the Sea.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm a big fan of David Bentley Hart.
Oh,
and
me
I
too.
think his theology is really rich and mostly I just want to sort of stand up and cheer. But there's a footnote here where I say something like what you've said. It's a footnote. I say, while I find Hart's arguments in That All Shall Be Saved in favor of universal salvation to be persuasive, it seems to me that in insisting that, quote, not only is an eternal free rejection of God unlikely, it is a logically vacuous idea. When he says that, he collapses the important analogical distinction between our share in the Logos and the being of the Logos itself. And sort of, you lose something in the doctrine of God and the doctrine of freedom, you lose something in your anthropology if you say, nope, it's just impossible. It's impossible to refuse the gift of grace. I think that's, I actually kind of like Karl Barth's language here about the impossible possibility. There is a kind of, there's a kind of irrational opportunity for us to refuse grace. And I think somehow that's sort of, again, if we can sort of, like you say, if we go too far and if we sort of make that logically vacuous, we've lost something important there.
Yeah, and I can certainly understand why somebody of Hart's prodigious intellect can usually people that have a prodigious intellect have a very, very low tolerance for any kind of contradiction. That's like part of what goes along with having that great intellectual capacity. So, but I don't really think that there is that kind of neat, absolutely free of contradiction resolution of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's right. That's right. Yeah, but it is. Yeah, Doors of the Sea is, in some ways, I think Doors of the Sea is what launched David Bentley Hart for the amazing work he does of sort of right between popular and rich sort of scholarly theology. He sort of goes back and forth between both. He wrote that. Not New York Times, but the other New York journal, Wall Street. Wall Street. He wrote the Wall Street Journal article on the tsunami.
Yes,
Doors of the Sea came out of that.
Came out of that article. Yeah.
And that really sort of launched him as somebody with this voice of that nobody else had, that could do this sort of so deeply resourced in the whole philosophical and theological tradition, and speaking this way that people were like sitting on the edge
and
of
he seemed in that book have be less determined to give the answer to the question.
Yeah.
I mean, he was
right.
willing to, in that book, let the problem of evil hang to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think he even says there that like the problem of evil is the one thing that has to resist any kind of logical explanation, just because that's the makeup of of evil within theology. That's an important thing to say, I think.
And I think the only thing that you were trying to say is that you think that the question of eternal hell is that same kind of that same kind of issue, and that we have within the scripture, we have both texts that point toward a universal restoration and texts that point toward an eternal hell. And if we can find some way to hold these things, even though they seem to be a paradox, if we can find a way to hold them together, we're probably closer to a truth that is beyond our comprehension.
That's right. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah,
you're getting me. That's where I'm aiming here.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's great. So I think let's. So what do you think? There's one more question I want to ask you about leaving Emmaus.
Sure.
You return to the prodigal son story like often.
Mm-hmm.
within the text. And it's interesting. I'm going to bring up Tomberg because Tomberg uses the prodigal son a lot as well in his text. And here's the question I have for you is that you kind of seem to leave unaddressed, because it doesn't fit into what you're doing, the question of the older son in that. So as long as I have you here, I want to ask you, what do you make of the elder son in the parable of the prodigal son?
Yeah. So my wife and I just finished watching Stranger Things season 4, one of the questions we kept asking about those last few episodes is, why weren't they broken up into, a couple different episodes? So you come to a resolution point, and then here comes the next part of it, but it's all jammed into 1 2-hour episode. Kind of feel like that with the parable of the prodigal son.
Right, right.
It's kind of 2 parables, Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. And you address one part of that parable a lot, so I'd like to hear your take on the other parable.
Yeah. So I use the story of the prodigal son and the relationship of the father and the son and the inheritance as a way of talking about the Trinity, especially. And then there's the second part, which is about the relationship of the two siblings. So yeah, that feels like a big question, though. What do I think about the second part of the parable? I suppose in light of what we've been talking about, there is a kind of you get to see in the second part of the parable the Father's grace extended in a different way. Here's what my grace looks like. Sort of when the sin is when the sin that my creatures are up against are dealing with is like whatever, negligence, wastefulness, just general prodigality, I suppose.
Right.
But then here, like, does that, if we want to look at this in terms, if we want to think about the parable in terms of universal salvation, what is that? How does the Father's grace meet a very different kind of sin? And so then you've got the elder brother who's seems to be the one who has lived without sin, but then you find out like he's got a pretty thick jealousy operating there. So what does the Father's grace look like when extended towards that? And so in a sense, he gets his share of the feast, even though he would like to sort of sulk off and remain outside the tent while they pull the chairs up to the table. So I suppose there's many things we could say about it, but one of the things that's occurring to me in light of our conversation is in the parable you get a kind of graciousness of God that's received differently as a different way of responding to human sins in the two sons and the two son characters in that parable. And
they both seem to not understand the Father. I would say that's where there's
common
language. So
that's right.
Neither see the Father as the Father is. Like that both of them fail to see the total, the absolute grace and generosity of the Father.
Yeah. What do you think the older son misses? What does he not see in the Father?
He never bothered to ask. Right? He never bothered to ask.
Yeah.
So he didn't he just he clung to the Father, but he never turned to the Father to ask for what he needed.
Yeah.
Which is still a failure to trust.
It's still a failure to trust. That's right.
Yeah,
that's
right. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've got one of the so I love to, you saw in Leaving Emmaus, but I love to play around with literature. As a way of sort of expanding. Oh, here's what it could look like here. And
do you have a background in drama?
Just not really a background, but a kind of running interest in.
Interest.
Yeah. Okay. But honestly, my college roommate did a double major in Shakespeare, and sort of listening to him talk about it, I was like, ooh, I think I've made wrong life choices. I want more of that. So as soon as I finished my first book, which was called Diagonal Advance, then I was like, I want to write about Shakespeare now. So I kind of dug in there.
Did you know? Did you know you wanted to study theology your whole life, or was there?
I knew pretty early. I started to get really interested in theology in high school. Started to really get excited about this sort of landscape where you could use your understanding and use the understanding of others and find the ways that it was compelling and and as a way of expanding the Bible and as a way of talking to one another about faith and who God is. I've gotten some really deep conversations with friends at high school about, grace and God's judgment and all these sorts of things that you and I've been talking about.
Mhm.
So I did that, and then I actually went and did a study abroad. Did a study abroad program in Russia 5 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so there's this just really rich theological environment there where priests were now saying things publicly that they hadn't been able to, and evangelicals were coming and holding revivals, and people were trying to sort out, and the families were trying to sort out in the middle, who do we think God is, and all of this. And I got to just sit with all sorts of people in the midst of this. And I came home thinking, this is what I want to do. I want to just sort of live in that world and try to sort out language of the Christian faith. So yeah, I think it was always sort of it was always the most obvious path that I was going to be heading down.
Were you raised in a Christian home then, or?
Yeah, I was. Church of the Nazarene was what I grew up in.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
My high school debate coach was a Nazarene pastor.
How about that? Come on.
Yeah.
So Midwestern holiness parents and grandparents and great grandparents, and then through that experience and through college, and then that experience in Russia, I eventually made my way to the Episcopal Church, which is where I am now. I'm the seminary that I'm at, and the church that I serve. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I know you have you talked about your experience in Russia. I know you have an interest in Bulgakov. So I was just like, your book happens to be sitting right now, like right on top of my copy of Bulgakov's dogmatic interpretation of the Apocalypse of John.
Oh, that's on my list. I haven't dug into that one yet.
Me either. It's sitting here because I'm getting ready to do a series on that. In August. So
good. I'll be definitely a fanboy in that one.
So
yeah, I started really, that was part of the reason I went to Russia. Well, the reason I went back to Russia in grad school, because this was before much Bulgakov was translated, and I realized at Virginia that was what I wanted to dig into as a sort of home base theologically, and I think that's continued to be the case. He's continued to be sort of home base for me theologically.
Yeah, for me too. Once I discovered him, I mean, I think I first heard about him through David Bentley Hart, and then once I started reading him, I couldn't stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah. So I would be. You live in Texas Hill Country. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what's the best barbecue.
Oh man, that is the right question. Man, here's a funny story about me. So I came from the Midwest 18 years ago now that I moved here. And my first fall, I was hanging out with our admissions director at the seminary. And during fall break, I just kind of went to visit. And he said, "Hey, have you ever had Texas barbecue?" And barbecue is like when you grill something and put barbecue sauce on it. Well, of course I've had barbecue. And I described, he's like, oh no. Like, come on, emergency, get in my car. So he took me down to the town of Lockhart, which is sort of Mecca for
absolutely. Like, epicenter.
I think Smitty's is where we went, and you've got the sort of the historic break between Smitty's and Black's, and now they've encroached out. Now there's a Black sitting in Austin, which I go to when I can, but my wife's vegetarian, so we don't get out that way too much. There's not much she can do at a barbecue joint.
Yeah, that's true.
When even the potato salad has, sort of meat fat in it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, I just had to ask because I've had an obsession with barbecue since since I was about 15 years old.
Oh man!
I saw the Texas barbecue episode of Great Chefs of the West, and I was raised by my grandparents. My granny was from Huntsville, and my grandpa was from Oklahoma City, and they used to talk about barbecue all the time, and and didn't have nice things to say about barbecue as it was in Washington. And I saw this Great Chefs of the West episode, and I became obsessed. And
oh man,
I've been cooking it ever since. I cooked
Is that right?
Yeah, I cooked professionally for most of my 20s and 30s too.
Wow, you do the brisket and all?
Oh yeah. I cooked my first brisket in 1986.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah, no, there's nothing like it. When I had that first taste at Smitty's and Lockhart, I was like, oh, the world is a little bit different now.
Yeah, it does. It is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
for sure.
There's something sacred about that thin blue smoke.
That's right. That's right. It absolutely is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one last like a little bit of personal thing that happened. I couldn't help but notice in your book. There's a point in the book where you have a phrase about what gamers refer to as a saving throw. Is that something that is that something you know firsthand or secondhand because of your interest in Stranger Things?
No, I know firsthand, but it's all due to this amazing colleague I've got, Nathan Jennings.
Okay.
He was a colleague of mine at both in grad school at Virginia. We studied with Gene Rogers and John Milbank together, and then he teaches liturgy. So we've taught down the hall from each other for most of 20 years now, and he's a big time gamer and dungeon master, and he holds a faculty quest. We try to do it twice a year, and so he's old school analog, pencil and paper and all of this. And so we go in and we find that gold and we kill the orcs. And so yeah, it's firsthand, but it's all due to my friend Nathan.
Well, yeah, I've been gaming since I was 11. But my favorite all-time game, but part of like I've had one of the reasons the channel is called Real Country is because I have like an obsession with Arthurian material for as long as I can remember. Like literally one of the first things I can remember reading was like A Tale of the Knights of King Arthur written for children.
Yeah.
When I must have been like four or five. And so my favorite all-time role-playing game is not surprisingly King Arthur Pendragon, which is a role-playing game set in Arthurian Britain.
Awesome. I did a course years ago. I only got to do it once because probably they were on to me, but I did a course at the seminary called Anglican Theology as Quest for the Holy Grail, and we read a bunch of Grail literature, and just sort of mapped it onto sort of Anglican Eucharistic theology and all of that. And it was a big blast, and we watched some movies together, and it was
that sounds awesome. I think that's probably why when my son came to me a couple of years ago, let me just tell you a little bit about it. I was raised Pentecostal, and then I was agnostic for most of my early adult life, and I went to Thomas Aquinas College, and I did end up converting to Catholicism like after my time at Thomas Aquinas College in like the mid 90s, but I never really that didn't really stick for me. So when I was in my late 40s, when I was coming back to faith again, at the same time I was like trying to figure out where I wanted to go to church, my son comes to me out of the blue and says, Dad, I think I want to be Anglican. And I'm like, what? Because like the Episcopal / Anglican tradition was like the last thing that's the one thing when I was in my early 20s, when I was on my seeker path, it's like the one thing I wrote off as like obviously wrong.
Yeah, not even interesting.
Immediately,
not even interesting,
without consideration. But I think like the two factors in me giving that consideration and deciding to follow him into that tradition was my interest in the matter of Britain was definitely a factor. And then my bookshelf is like, I've got so many Anglican theologians that I've been reading, and which is actually, this is the argument he made when I said, what, really? He actually just like, didn't even say a word. He just pointed silently at my bookshelf.
You're like,
and I'm like, okay, good point, all right, good point. I'll check it out. All bad. We'll try it. It can't be all bad. So
yeah. That's good.
So, yeah.
And then you landed I don't know how the story ends. You landed Orthodox. Is that where you are now?
No. We're currently attending Christ Our Hope Anglican Church in Olympia, Washington.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Gotcha. And my priests are both like very informed by patristic theology and are favorably disposed toward a lot of Orthodox ideas, but there's not really any Orthodox churches. I probably would have landed Orthodox had it been more geographically convenient. But there just aren't any Orthodox churches anywhere close to the area where I live.
Mm-hmm.
So
you just retained it through the fathers and through your own readings and things.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really great to talk to you. And
thanks for
know you.
Thanks so much again for having me on the show. It's been a really fun conversation.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah.